The aging effect is very real. There becomes with age an inefficiency of the muscle to process amino acids. We call it anabolic resistance, but I think the proper term is probably inefficiency, although we can't really measure that. You know what I mean? We measure the gross measures of protein synthesis, sometimes breakdown, balance, that kind of thing. So we're measuring the kinetics and the metabolics of it all.
So at what age does this manifest?
Yeah, that depends on the individual. I think that and you're an exercise guy and you're a lifelong exerciser. So I think what we have done is push the curve to the right, but I think we're still on the curve. You know what I mean? So just because you're pushing it to the right doesn't mean you gave it the Heisman. You know, you're holding hands with the curve. So I think that depends too, again, on the individual. But I would venture to say, you know, I'm starting to over the years now study, you know, we used to study young and old, but I'm starting to realize that these transitions occur, quote, in middle age. So I think studying more of the 40-year-olds, especially in our society, shows you that it's really starting then. That this resistance is starting. And it depends. If you're in pretty shitty shape, it's there. You know what I mean? If you have done nothing, if you're a couch potato and you're a land squid and you're processing oxygen, you know, it's you. It's you.
You know, if you're a land squid, it almost doesn't matter. You're gonna feel like shit and be like shit anyway.
Well, that's right. Most people are happy with that. You're right. You're exactly right. Now, to your second question about sex differences. Most of the literature says if you look at acute responses, we really can't tease out a sex difference. However, again, the things that we've started, in fact, we have a project on board looking at postmenopausal women, pre and postmenopausal women. And Abby Smith Ryan and I collaborated on some work looking at the menopause transition. And I think from a physiological standpoint, it's a pretty serious demarcation point. And from what I see, we don't have enough data. I would hypothesize, and it looks like it's in the perimenopause period, that the protein kinetics go awry.
Around roughly what age would that be?
Yeah, somewhere around 45 to 50, I think, is the general sweet spot. Some women go earlier, some women go later.
Okay.
But there's kind of a 5-year period there, I think. And so the point is that for some reason, when that, you know, perimenopause period begins, meaning that their menstrual cycle becomes inconsistent, there seems to be a lesser signal to the skeletal muscle such that protein turnover reduces. Why is that important? Well, protein turnover is a very expensive process. And by the way, if you add it up, it comes up to about 300-400 calories a day. So just extrapolate that. 300 calories a day over 10 days is what? 3,500 calories, right? There's a pound. So if you notice, I don't know where your wife is, but she's pretty active. She may not have had this problem, but most women who go through menopause, I mean, to the woman, have complained to me, I'm gaining weight. I'm gaining weight. I'm still active, but I'm gaining weight. I get weight here. So I think, you know, that seems to be, there's a real physiological reason for that rationale, that the inefficiency of the muscle is such that all those calories that used to be expended that were either stored or intramuscular that were expended in the protein turnover system are no longer being expended and being stored instead. And again, it doesn't take long to gain a pound when you're talking 300 kilocalories a day. So
with women, there's two things going on. There's the age issue, and then around perimenopause, there's that issue. So would it be more problematic for women vis-a-vis protein intake compared to men? Because obviously men aren't going through perimenopause.
Yeah, I think my point is that the physiological demarcation point is more noticeable in women because of the menopause transition, right?
Right.
Men don't quite have that strict demarcation point, right? We just kind of get older and things start to slide and become painful, et cetera. But we kind of end up in the same spot. So aging is in effect part of the whole menopause transition. Now, that's coupled with the fact that when you look at most women, they don't really take in enough protein. So that really, so now you're exacerbating the problem. So as I just told you earlier in the conversation, you need more of the essential amino acids to upregulate and overcome the anabolic resistance, but they're not getting it. Okay. And or they're not getting it in enough meals. Usually they only have an intake of enough protein in only one meal. So now you can see how this is all exacerbating the issue, right? You went through menopause, the muscle becomes less sensitive, you're not taking in enough protein. And oh, by the way, instead of protein, you're taking in carbohydrates. Guess where this is all going? So now you gain weight. Weight means inflammation in the muscle. Inflammation means the beginning of many disease states, most likely diabetes. And so now again, you look at our population, look how many people, and I'm going back to my PCP down the hall here. He's a medicine doc. You know, how many people come in and see him with that 5.7 to 6.4 A1C range, just on the slide, starts them off in metformin, which he and puts it off, you know what I mean? But the point is, if things don't change, they end up being overt diabetics.
Yeah. And of course, we're talking about the general population that does nothing. So there's a whole host of bad things that happen to those individuals that I think for the most part would, you know, I hate to use the word cure, but it would cure a lot of these things. I mean, but unfortunately, most people don't move. They don't exercise. They don't.
Give me a pill, doc. Give me a pill, doc.
Fine.
Why do you think
They're lazy.
Trulicity and all these drugs are a multi-billion-dollar business? Because you can sit on your ass and do nothing. You and I both know research has clearly shown to get out of the diabetic state, diet and exercise always works.
It always works.
But how many people exercise, right? That's the problem, right? That's the problem.
Hardly anyone exercises. That's the crazy part.
We're in a very unique field. You know.
Yeah, it's interesting that when we go to FISSN conference, you're surrounded by people who you think are the majority, but they are a tiny
sliver. Tiny sliver. That's right.
It's insane. It's insane. Now, we only have a few minutes left. I want to touch on this, I think, and you'll have to refresh my memory. This was, I don't know if you wrote it or Bob Wolf wrote it or both of you wrote it. It had something to do with consuming up to 70 grams of protein in a meal and looking at not just muscle protein synthesis, but degradation. Explain, you know, what that means, because there's always the argument, you know, with the bro science people about, is it 30 grams? Is it 40 grams? You know, what if I'm a Darren Willoughby and like to consume 100 grams per meal? I mean, what happens to those, to the protein, the amino acids? I assume a lot of it's just oxidized because you can't store it. So tell the audience a little bit about that.
Yeah. The 30 grams, I think, came from Stu and Stu Phillips and a bunch of colleagues that kind of did that with whey protein that showed the break point in terms of muscle protein synthesis was about that. But you have to understand, what people don't understand is this is not a switch, it's a rheostat. Okay. In other words, you can upregulate synthesis to a certain degree, but at some point, breakdown has to upregulate too to keep up with it. Okay. So in other words, it's a dynamic process, and insulin, of course, has a lot to do with it. So in a general sense, I will say that if there's enough amino acids available, again, Bob Wolf a number of years ago wrote a very, very nice review in this regard and gave international presentations on it based on all our data and everything else. The bottom line is that if the amino acids are plentiful, the insulin response serves to promote protein synthesis. When the amino acids become a little more limiting, the insulin response is such that it prevents degradation. Okay, so you cannot, what the viewers have to understand, you cannot ramp up protein synthesis forever, whether it's EAAs, testosterone, it doesn't matter. That's not the way the body works. In order to support synthesis from a muscle standpoint, you need the intracellular amino acid. You get them because they're the ones that form protein. You get them from two sources. One, the blood transports them in, or two, the muscle itself breaks down protein to do that. And so I keep pointing to the fact that in the early days, I studied burn patients. I think, you know, I grew up in a burn unit. And in burn patients, you find that if you just looked at muscle protein synthesis, you'd think they're anabolic because it's twice normal. However, breakdown's 3 times normal. Okay, so in them, it becomes a big futile cycle, in part to provide the amino acids to all the more important things to keep them alive at that time. So that's the issue. You have to understand that you don't get one without the other. You may get a net synthesis to a certain degree. That's what we found with the essential amino acids and all those studies with cross-limb models and things of that nature. Whey protein the same way, but you don't get unmitigated synthesis forever and ever. Amen.
Well, how much does protein degradation or the inhibition of protein degradation play a role in the net muscle protein accretion?
Yeah, that's a good point too. I think that here's what I always say. You may have heard me say this at the ISSN the last couple of years. But everybody becomes myocentric. And you can only afford to be myocentric if the whole body is happy. The whole body takes precedence, okay? Again, borrowing from all the stress states that I've studied in my life. If the whole body isn't happy, the muscle is no longer any type of anabolic organ. It is merely a supplier for the rest of the body. So, in other words, if the whole body isn't happy, then the initial protein will go to suffice or making the whole body happy, either synthesis or reduction of protein breakdown. Once you get the whole body happy, now the muscle can pay attention to being the anabolic organ. It can switch from being a supplier, because it's the only supply of amino acids we really have that's labile, to actual functional anabolic organ. So in that regard, that's the answer to the question. They both have to be happy. And again, if there's a stress state, hypocaloric, for example, pathology, disease state, whatever, the whole body's taking precedence. The muscles. And in fact, I always say this: when I first got into burns work, the patients would die, Joey. We knew how to, at that time, we knew how to cover burns and we knew how to do all that stuff. But the patients would die after a certain period of time because of loss of lean mass, not because of the burn. And only after all those years that we started using all those anabolic agents and we were able to mitigate that we have almost universal success, unless they have major inhalation injury or something with getting people. I mean, my last years there, I couldn't tell you how many people over 90% total body surface burn area were walking out of the burn room.
Explain more to the audience. This will be the last question. Explain more to the audience why the loss of lean mass contributes to such high mortality. And that's why if you end up in a hospital, you want to at least have some semblance of muscle mass or lean body mass, because you'll survive being in the hospital. So yeah, explain that to the audience.
Well, which goes back to what I was saying, the stress response. So when the body is stressed, all the muscle does is serve as an amino acid reservoir for everything. So all the other things in the body that are more important, okay, usually immune proteins, the liver is the big player here, right? All the things that the immune system and the bone marrow and everything else produce to keep the organ alive, to keep the organism to survive. All those amino acids, in great part, will come from skeletal muscle. And when that runs out, then you get into organ failure and death. That's what happens very, very quickly.
Now, do we know at what point, I mean, how much lean mass would you have to lose, or is there a threshold amount of lean body mass that you have to have?
Yeah, that depends on the pathology. In fact, I'm giving it in this talk we're going to talk about. I borrowed some information from a burn surgeon many years ago, and it says like 10% loss of lean mass, immune functions compromised. After that, wound healing is compromised. Somewhere around 30 to 40% of lean mass is death.
Wow.
So it really doesn't, I mean, we're not talking 100%. And oh, by the way,
that's
to that point, if you ever go back and read the Belfast studies where those guys fasted themselves to death back in the 70s, and they were characterized, and the blood amino acid levels in those people who went on this prolonged starvation were maintained normal until the very end when they died.
Wow.
Because again, the lean mass was maintaining those levels until it could no longer, and then they died.